All right. Well, greetings to all of you who are joining us today. And as director for the Center of International Law here at the National University of Singapore, I am so excited to be moderating this webinar with two extraordinary people, diplomats, friends, who need very little introduction. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing them, but Ambassador Rena Lee, who is really just fresh off, I won't say the ship again because you can hear that again, New York, after a marathon session, negotiating and finalizing, that's why we're celebrating today, finalizing one of the most anticipated international agreements in international law. It's too long, so we just say BBNJ agreement. And we say only CIO can do this. We have not only Rena Lee, but the extraordinary Professor and Ambassador Tommy Ko, who is the legendary president of what we call the Constitution for the Oceans, the Law of the Sea Convention. What a thrill, what a delight it is to have both of you, and I thank you both for being with us. Today, we're really just going to have a conversation with both of you, and not so much about the details of the BBNJ agreement at all. That will come in due time, but we really want to do, having this tremendous opportunity to have both of you with us and a wonderful audience, to just talk about, how do you negotiate such a major agreements with so many different states with divergent interests. How does negotiations work? So it's just going to be some questions. We'll do questions for about the first half an hour and then invite our audience to put their questions on the chat. So my questions are to the both of you. And I think first of all, we have the Law of the Sea Convention, Constitution for the Oceans, and now we also have the BBNJ agreement. Are they different? What's the relationship between these two agreements? So let's just start off with that. And Tommy, do you want to go first with that? And then I'll ask Rena.
Yes, happy to do that. And very happy to be with Rena, who's a good friend and someone I've admired for a long time. I want to say something about the nature of the relationship between the 1982 convention and the BBNJ agreement. The first point I want to make is that the 1982 convention is the mother treaty. And this mother treaty has given birth to 3 children. The first child was born in 1994 in an implementing agreement which effectively amended Part 11 of the convention. Then in the following year, 1995, there was another implementing agreement on the governance of highly migratory fish and fish like salmon that live in several jurisdictions during their life cycle. And now we have the third child. This BBNJ agreement will be adopted by the UN General Assembly as an implementing agreement under UNCLOS. And it will come into force after it's received 60 ratification, as in the case of UNCLOS. But I think a point I want Rena to confirm is that a country need not be a party to UNCLOS to sign this agreement. And the other point I want to ask Rena to confirm is that in the event of a dispute between parties to BBNJ agreement, the provisions of Part 15 of UNCLOS will apply. Is that correct, Rena?
All right, thank you. So Rena, Ambassador Lee, we ask you the same question. How do you see that relationship between the mother treaty and now this newly born agreement?
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to many of the friends I see here. In fact, we have many of the negotiators participating in this conversation. So very happy to see all friends, old and new. And thank you very much to CIL for inviting me to join Ambassador Koh, who of course has been a teacher, a mentor. You know, people ask, how did you prepare for it? I said, I learned from the very best. So I had an advantage. I learned from the very best. I mean, indeed, it is true that the BBNJ agreement is meant to be an implementing agreement under UNCLOS. I think that's quite clear in the mandate in 72 General Assembly Resolution 72249. It says under UNCLOS. And under UNCLOS can only mean, well, you have this overarching constitution for the oceans, that legal framework for the oceans. And then under that, you have the implementing agreements, the Part 11 agreement, the fish stocks agreement, and now the BBNJ agreement. So that's really the nature of the relationship. In answer to that first question, do you have to be a party to UNCLOS to be a party to the BBNJ agreement? The answer is no. I mean, that's in line with the fish stocks agreement. Second question, Part 15, the dispute settlement provisions in the BBNJ agreement does replicate Part 15. The language is a little not quite the same as the fish stocks agreement, and I'm sure that will give many generations of law students and law academics much fodder for passing out the language of what exactly that article on dispute settlement means. But there is that provision on dispute settlement.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Well, so both of you, of course, have gone through now led negotiations, and I've been part of negotiations, but I can't imagine what it is to really be leading those negotiations with states. But they're 40 years apart, and I think that's what's so extraordinary. We have two Singaporeans, which I didn't mention, but two Singaporeans 40 years later presiding over two very important negotiations. Looking at the negotiations, do you see any similarities, differences? So just to reflect a little bit on that. So again, who would like to go first? Shall we start with Tommy? Shall I let Tommy go? All right, Tommy.
Okay. I think there are similarities, but also very important differences in the negotiating process of UNCLOS and BBNJ. In the case of UNCLOS, there were many interest groups formed by states. And so we had to deal with the interest groups, and sometimes they would negotiate directly with each other. Then a very unique feature of the third conference were private negotiating groups. And some of the most critical issues in UNCLOS were negotiated and resolved in these closed private negotiating groups. For example, on straits used for international navigation, there was a private negotiating group convened by Fiji and the United Kingdom, and they only invited 13 delegations to take part. I think that feature is absent, if I'm not wrong, from the negotiating process in BBNJ. And I think the reason is that times have changed. What was acceptable 40 years ago is no longer acceptable. People want transparency, they want inclusiveness, they want to participate. So I think that there were important similarities and important differences.
Well, thank you very much for that. Actually, I think Ambassador Koh has the advantage on me because he, of course, was at the third conference and he could see the process for BBNJ. Actually, some of the delegates asked me if I was at the third conference, and I was like, am I that old? I was, well, actually, I was in primary school during the third conference. So I don't have direct experience of the third conference, but I did, of course, have the advantage of consulting Ambassador Cole. I think, you know, Ambassador Cole is absolutely right. The times have changed, they're different. And actually, when we began the IGC process in my consultations with delegations, a number of delegations did ask, could we follow the UNCLOS model? But it was a little bit more challenging. For one thing, I think the pace of negotiations has picked up a lot. Relative to, I can say this because when I started in international negotiations, it was a time when literally the internet did not exist. Yeah. So I imagine that it must have been like that during the third conference. Yeah. There were no cell phones, no internet, no social media. And I think, if I'm not wrong, the third conference met for 10 weeks at a time. We only had 2 weeks. And we were meeting in New York where many of the delegates were New York based and had to cover a lot of issues. But also it was the pace was, although many people thought it was slow, but in fact much faster, because anytime anybody says something, you can get on your phone, you can get on your tablet, you go and Google, you find out whether it's right or wrong, and you can respond immediately to it. But I think what was similar, just based off what Ambassador Cole said, it's true we didn't have negotiations, but all along I was encouraging delegations to reach out to one another, to speak with one another, to clarify and understand, because these are some really technical and complex issues. And it's not sufficient in a plenary for you to talk across one another, but really to engage with one another, to be able to really understand what were the underlying interests and to try and find the common ground. We didn't have the kinds of private negotiations that the third conference had, but we did, I did at the beginning of the fifth session, try to institute small working groups of the most interested delegations based on the informals, which were held in large rooms, to go off into a corner on their own and to work at it. We, throughout the process, refined it, because I think that sometime in the second week of the August session, it got a little bit chaotic and people couldn't quite follow. So this time around, we were very clear about putting out a timetable, allowing people to know when the small groups were meeting, where the small groups were meeting, what the small groups were meeting on. And I hope that it made a difference to the process. Because we know that there are certain issues where it was useful to get a small group of delegations together to work it out. But ultimately, I think, you know, it still required the buy-in of all the delegations that were participating in the negotiations. It's just that having some of these small groups, I think, were very useful to the process. Of course, I still continue to encourage delegations to go off and speak on their own as well.
I have a question. Were the small groups open-ended? And did you appoint somebody to be the facilitator for each small group?
They were open-ended, and we did appoint facilitators for the small groups. But I think that, as I said, maybe initially the process was a little not so clearly defined, such that it resulted in a little bit of confusion as to where certain small groups were meeting, and we didn't have sufficient rooms. And I think there was some discomfort by delegations that some of the small groups were led by proponents of particular proposals. So when we ended in August, I took some time to reflect on the process, and then And then we refined the process in consultation with my bureau, of course. We refined the process, and most, although not all of the small groups were then led by the facilitators of that particular element as well, so that there was an element of neutrality, and we set out very clearly when the small group would meet, and I hope that made a difference.
Yeah.
One more question. One of the features of your negotiating process was that there was something called precedence consultation. Right? Could you explain what this is?
The president's consultations were really just fundamentally closed-door sessions. Closed-door sessions that were open to all member states, but were closed to observers. And they were consultations that enabled member states to have frank conversations, frank exchanges of views with one another without there being, which would enable them to clear the air about maybe certain miscommunications or certain misconceptions, to really understand and then to be able to work out compromises. They were very well attended. I think all the major delegations were in those precedents consultations, and it was just to give a space for delegations to be able to work through some of the issues.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, this is wonderful to have president to president conversation. Exactly. But actually, I think, well, one thing too, Tommy, you didn't have a pandemic in the middle of the UNCLOS negotiations, and that clearly happened in this.
Yeah.
If I could just follow up.
We had a political disaster.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. The United States elected a new president, Ronald Reagan, who rejected the prior oceans policy of the United States. And that caused a lot of trouble for us. All
right, not quite a pandemic, but okay. But you know what's interesting? And so the point you raised, Rena, 2 weeks at a time. And I've always wondered, these negotiations go for 2 weeks. And obviously at the end, you suffered with 36 hours nonstop to bring Tommy, 10 weeks. How can you do you think it's better to have the 10-week version? Is that now impractical under modern circumstances? Did it serve it better? Although they both took approximately, the negotiations both took years. So any thoughts on that?
Well, we started with our basic text. I don't know whether Rena had we had no basic text. So that took a number of years. I think it was only in 1976 at the third session that we gave to the three chairmen the mandate to offer draft treaty articles in their respective domain. The other thing is that we had a very ambitious agenda, and both broad and to some extent revolutionary. So it took some time for us to understand the issue, to identify the competing interest groups, to bring them together, to embody our agreement in treaty language. I would say that we spent several years understanding the issues, understanding each other, building trust and confidence in one another. At the end, we succeeded at the end because there was a critical mass of delegates to the conference who shared a common vision and a common agenda. And they cut across interest group, regional groups. And it was this group of men and women that led the conference brought the ship to shore, to use Rena's language. It took time, I must say, it took time for us to develop that understanding of the issues, mutual trust, the evolution of a group of conference leaders who effectively steered the conference to success.
And it sounds like that was the 10-week process, and you didn't have to spend 36 hours negotiating at the end. Rena,
no.
what do you think?
Well, I mean,
short time.
I think nowadays it would be really, really challenging to be able to find a 10-week block of time to devote yourself entirely to one subject. But you know, listening to Ambassador Cole, there's another similarity. Indeed, we only produced the text at the third session ourselves. So there was another similarity with the third conference. And I know maybe what I'm going to say, after the third conference, we had this gap of about 2 years because of the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, and I know it sounds kind of simplistic to say this, but what I wanted to do in the conference was to build that friendly and engaging atmosphere where the negotiators could view each other as friends. I mean, obviously, it's not impossible to negotiate when you're like staring daggers at one another, but it's a lot easier to do when you're friends, and to build that element of we're in this together, and we are going to move ahead together. And then the pandemic happened, and it's not a very popular view, I think, but I felt that the pandemic helped in a couple of ways. There was, of course, concern that we would lose momentum, but I think it helped in a couple of ways. The first way that it helped was it gave delegations that breathing space to really understand the technicalities of the issues that they were negotiating. Thanks to a group of countries that organized what we call the High Seas Dialogues, I think that gave negotiators that space and that time to really relook the issues and to really understand the technicalities. But also, of course, over the course of the pandemic, we had many changes in delegates. And the other thing that was helpful was that the pandemic gave these new delegates time to understand the issues, to understand the process, to get to know other delegates outside of that formal space. Otherwise, when we came back, we would have to kind of a little bit restart the whole process. So I know when we started the fourth session, and that was, I guess, about a year ago when we started the fourth session, there were a lot of concerns because there was still a number of COVID restrictions placed on us. But I thought that the time was right to come back to work, and there was a bit of concern that we wouldn't be able to get a move on. But you know, the delegates, I'm so grateful to them, and all credit go to the negotiators, the civil society, all the observers. They really pushed on, and that gave us, I think, that confidence, that momentum to move into the fifth session and to conclude. So really, all the credit goes to them.
Well, Rena, and I think you deserve some credit as well to foster that. I think that's so important, and just, you both have touched on this, and maybe we could, you could both elaborate a little bit more, and perhaps future negotiators. Trust is so important, building that confidence, not only trust in the leadership, but trust in the process itself. So, you know, from both of your experiences, what is it, do you think, that really builds trust? What do you think, perhaps, Tommy or Rena, that you felt really gave an atmosphere where the delegations finally were able to bridge certain differences, which inevitably there are, of course?
In the case of the third conference, there were many leaders in the conference. You know, it wasn't just me, because we had different interest groups, and interest groups have their leaders. And then there are people who want to just help solve the problems of the conference. So I always joke that the most effective delegate at the third conference was our friend from Fiji, Satyanandan, you know, who helped to solve so many issues, you know, the Straits, archipelagos, and so on. What makes him so effective is that he was trusted. He was trusted because first, he is competent. Second, he's honest. And that his only objective is to try to bring about a compromise, a consensus. And the way he operates is that he always uses a text. He would come out with a text, give it to the negotiator, listen to them, take their feedback into account, he'll produce a new text, you know. That's his way of operating, whereas my way of operating is quite different. I like to chair negotiation among the interested parties and on the spot try to craft language which is acceptable to the various delegations. But at the end of the day, the conference come to know who can be trusted, who are competent, who are honest, who are reliable. And these people achieve a certain status and help to move the conference forward, I think.
Rena, I think I have to agree. I mean, first of all, that question is better addressed to the delegates. Before you know, they'll say, oh no, we totally didn't trust the president. But, you know, I have to agree. What I've said is that this conference, the IGC, was a success because of the efforts of many, many, many people. Not just, it wasn't me. I played only a very small part. And in fact, delegations, negotiators who are in this call will know that I've always said that I have kind of the least important job in the world, because I'm not the one that has to make the hard choices as to when to compromise, when to hold firm, and what are the interests we were prepared to find common ground on. But I think we were very blessed in our facilitators who led the conversations. You know, the way the mandate of BBNJ was developed, from the very outset, we knew we were doing a package of issues. And we had facilitators for all elements of the package. And they really rose to the occasion. And it was clear that delegations had a lot of trust in them, because there were always calls for the facilitators to not be afraid to put on language, to be able to try and bring people together. And you're right, there were, I mean, in any process, I think, and this was certainly true, it seems to have been true of the third conference, and it was certainly true for the IGC, there were leaders, both formal and informal, in the process that delegates had their faith in, leaders of the different negotiating groups, those who facilitated, and even leaders of delegations who would try to bring, who would try to build bridges and bring different points of views together. So I think overall, it's just that, you know, sometimes these processes, when you're all don't really know one another, you need to learn more about one another. And then, you know, you come to a point where you're so comfortable with one another that you can really sit down and negotiate the issues. So I think it was just that people found but people were comfortable negotiating with one another.
Yeah, no, that's so important. And what we hear, obviously, that leadership is important, and you won't, and I don't expect you're genuinely a modest person, I know, Rena, but I think you, and I can say that you set a tone, and Tommy did as well, and that's leadership. But it's not just one person. There are many people who contribute to that, and acknowledging, and it's finding the right people who can do that. Because ultimately, I think what we see from negotiations, that comes down to people. It really does, you know, these interpersonal relationships. But one thing I want to, again, trying to ferret out some of the differences between the two 40 years apart. Civil society, you know, how much was civil society involved in the UNCLOS negotiations? Did they have side events? I was just thinking about that. Whereas now we know it's very common to have side events and UN events. and Rena as well. So I'm asking both of you the role of civil society.
In the third conference, the UN didn't allow NGOs and civil society to participate. However, I reached out to them in several ways. For example, in negotiating Part 11, one of the critical issues was financial terms of mining contracts. And when I was given the job of chairing this negotiating group, I told my American friend, Elliot Richardson, that he's given me mission impossible. You know, how am I going to negotiate financial terms of an industry that doesn't exist and where the parameters are unknown, you know? But he said, if you don't have financial terms in the treaty will not be approved by the Senate. So they said, well, you got to do it. And then I was saved by MIT. You know, MIT at that point published an academic paper on the future parameters of this yet to be born seabed mining industry. And I reached out to them and I brought them to New York and said, can you please make a presentation to the conference, you know, on your study? And I think the delegates had faith in the integrity that these people are not representing the Americans. This is an academic exercise. And I was able to persuade the delegates to use the computer model as an instrument of our negotiation, you know. So that was quite an achievement I'm proud of. The other thing I did was that I reached out to NGOs to help educate delegates. Because many of the delegates from the smaller countries were not as well informed, not as knowledgeable as delegates from the advanced country. And I found that the knowledge gap, for example, on fisheries, on the continental shelf. So I asked some of the NGOs to help me hold seminars, especially on weekends, and invited delegates to attend these. There's a group of NGOs, they call themselves the Neptune Group. And I worked closely with them, you know, to help raise the level of knowledge of all delegations to a more or less comparable level. So I used the NGOs, but they were not allowed to take part in our negotiation.
Interesting.
I think maybe another sign of how times have changed.
Yeah.
I think today we expect civil society and we want civil society to be a part of the negotiations. And of course, civil society was welcome. Except, of course, there is this protocol in the UN where member states get to speak before civil society. And towards the end, when negotiating time became very precious, you know, typically the civil society would not intervene directly. But that is not to say that civil society played very minimal or no role in the negotiations. In fact, I give civil society much credit for first 20 or so years ago, bringing this issue to our attention and working tirelessly to really push all of us to say, we can do this, this is possible, you need to do this, the oceans need this. And all credit to civil society for that. But during the IGC process itself, they held many side events. I mean, sometimes you will be running from side event to side event. There were multiples side events, although towards the end, I was a little bit, I guess, maybe we can say harsh in suggesting that the lunchtime and the before and after were precious time for delegations to get together to negotiate. But I know that civil society also supported, just as Ambassador Koh said, supported delegations in enhancing their understanding of their issues, in really putting out a lot of briefs that were shared with delegates to help delegations to understand the issues. And I said intersessionally, there was this group that organized the High Seas Dialogue that helped to bring delegations together intersessionally as well, and really, you know, help to raise awareness of the different issues, helped us to understand the issues. And I think that was really helpful. I mean, for myself as a lawyer, I mean, obviously there are many things about the science that I don't understand. So being able to consult scientists, I thought was very helpful, and vice versa. I think this, which is why I keep saying this is really a collective effort of so many people that made this possible.
Yeah, and if I can just pipe in, I know, I mean, I personally have a member of IUCN, so I know they were very active. And I thought because there was so much science involved, particularly in the BBNJ, but UNCLOS as well. And I think that probably was very important because we're lawyers, as you say, Rena, and the science, it's so important to be able to have that information, particularly in the marine genetic resources. I learned a lot myself, through that process. So I can see the benefit. And not to put anyone on the spot, but and Rena, you're a seasoned negotiator from the climate change negotiations. It seemed to me, and maybe I'm wrong, but I found the BBNJ process to be much friendlier to civil society than the climate change. And it just may be the nature of it, but I don't want to put anyone on the spot. That's my own observation. I just really felt that it was a very open environment for civil society. But at the end, of course, understandable. It comes down to states. The states have to, come to an agreement. And I think the purpose is to facilitate that.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe part of it is just the scale of the different negotiations. I mean, even not so key climate change meeting attracts 10, 12, 15,000 people. Oh, I remember I was in Copenhagen, they were saying about 40,000 people were there. And it means that the conference as a whole becomes a lot more diffuse. In contrast, I think our process was much on a much smaller scale, maybe 1,500, 2,000 people. And that made it easier for that kind of interaction, I would say. Maybe it's just the different nature of where we had the meetings and how the meetings were held and how many people attended the meetings, I would say. I did want to say one point though. Many people have asked me how we, how I had sort of prepared for the conference. I encourage everyone attending to please go to the UN Audiovisual Library and download one of Ambassador Koh's lectures, the 10 lessons of intergovernmental conferences. And I started and worked my way through from lesson number 1, which is to know your brief, all the way to lesson number 10. I think you can still download it. So, I encourage people to do that.
Thank you, Rena.
Well, definitely. One difference I'm going to say between the two of you, and I may be wrong, Rena, you also have a day job, which is what you do. And Tommy, I think that was your full-time job, wasn't it?
No.
No?
Our country is so small that we have multiple jobs. So when I was doing the Law to Sea conference, I was ambassador to the UN, ambassador to Canada, ambassador to Mexico. So I was a very busy boy.
And Rena, right now, you're heading, of course, the intellectual property agency in Singapore. That's your full-time job. So how did you do it, really? That's a big job. You're supervising hundreds of people. It's really, again, you don't have to answer, but I just want to say I find it amazing because preparing for the BBNJ had to be quite a task.
I think as Ambassador says, we're a small country, so we all do multiple jobs, but maybe, and I know some of my colleagues are here, really grateful to the men and women of the IPOS group for your patience and understanding. But I think, this again is not a popular view, but the pandemic helped as well. because we didn't travel, and we could do a lot of things online, which I think prior to the pandemic, people were less keen on. And that was very helpful because it meant that I could traverse many thousands of miles without ever leaving my seat.
Okay.
So we have some questions here. One, I think, from a good friend as well, Andreas Aditya Salim. He says that some credit should go to the Vienna Cafe as well.
That is true. That is true.
A good meeting point for the delegates. So we have a message from our friend Sharon Seah, who congratulates Ambassador Lee, and thank you to CIL for organizing the webinar. And she's asking, would you, Ambassador Lee, and Prof. Co consider co-writing a book on differences and similarities of UNCLOS and BBNJ? Watch out, Rena.
I will say, others are welcome to do so. To be honest, I think I haven't really had the time to process this. And the questions that you asked me today, if you ask me 5 years later, my answer could be entirely different. I don't have the benefit of hindsight at this point in time.
Yeah, I would suggest that Nilofer, you and your colleagues in the Ocean Law and Policy program should do such a book.
Actually, I'm fascinated. I think, Chris, Bob Beckman's not here, but Tara is. I know she's out there in the audience. I think it would be a really good project. It's very interesting, different negotiations. So maybe that's something we have to look into.
Yeah.
Definitely. There are other questions here, but I have to say, please forgive us to the audience. We don't want to go into a substance of the agreements yet. It's still early for that. So we're really, really focusing on the negotiation process. And we don't want to focus on any groups or of countries. So that's why it's not that I'm ignoring you, but I'm not going to ask those questions. But if you can ask general questions about negotiations between these two, we definitely welcome those questions. So again, forgive me, but I am going to limit, I'm not going to ask these questions. So let's see.
Tara have a question?
Tara? Tara, are you going to be the editor of the book?
Hello, hi everyone. Yes, that is that's a wonderful idea, and I think that we should definitely look into it. I think BBNJ is going to be a very topical and exciting topic, and CIL should expand its research on that. But only, of course, if Nilofer co-edits the book along with Prof. Co and Rena. I don't actually have, I just think it's both outcomes of negotiations are just, wonderful. And there are a lot of parallels that can be drawn between them. I guess the question I would have is for Rena, what is the key takeaway when it comes to getting consensus and agreement? And I think you've probably touched upon this in terms of trust and et cetera. Well, what do you think was the most important thing for you to get that ship across the shore? Or ship to the shore?
I guess being open and having many consultations with delegations. I did at one of the sessions ask delegations to outline their top 3 priorities. That helped a lot to understand where the different delegations were coming from. but also so that people understand. Actually, in negotiations, I think I went in knowing that basically I cannot make 100% of the people happy 100% of the time. This, you know, and I don't know how to answer this question. It's a question that maybe 5 years later I can answer the question. Right now, it's all still new.
Yeah.
And of course, our work is not quite done yet. And in fact, delegates who are in this call can expect communications from me very soon on how we move the process forwards. So it's not fully done yet. But again, I mean, I think there must be that desire on the part of delegates to want this result, to want to come to consensus. Many people have reported on our 36, 38, 40 hour, depending on when you started counting marathon. But that I couldn't have insisted on it if the delegates themselves were not prepared to work through. It's the dedication and the commitment of the delegates that got us to shore, not me.
I want to make a point.
Yes, please do.
I was very worried for Rena. Before she went for the final meeting, I remember having lunch with her, and what on top of my mind was, how do we insulate this negotiation from the geopolitics of the world? You know, the world has become increasingly divided into contending groups. There's less and less trust between and among major power. So I'm worried that, you know, the division in the world might somehow impact the conference, but it didn't happen, right? No, huh? Well, we're very lucky that it happened.
Yeah. Again, I say it's the dedication and commitment of delegations. I did, I guess, nag people. I have lots of experience in nagging. So I did nag, you know, having an adult son, I have lots of experience in nagging. And I told all the delegations this, I would nag you into engaging with one another. But, you know, ultimately it's the delegates themselves, the negotiators themselves that rose to the occasion, I would say.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, it's a fascinating process. Well, one question, so we have regional groups now. Tommy, were there regional groups at UNCLOS? I mean, now we have the, you know, the EU, the African group, this group. Did they have those regional groups? Or is it just thematic groups versus country groups?
I want to say that Prof. Jayakumar, I don't know whether he's with us, Prof. Jaya and I wrote a very long chapter on the nature of the negotiating process at the third conference. It's in the University of Virginia Commentary, Volume 1. The negotiating process was very complicated because you not only have the normal usual groups, you know, the regional groups, Group 77, the OECD country. Then you've got all kinds of interest groups, the Coastal States group, the Landlocked GDS group, the Archipelagos group, the Straits group, the Continental Shelf Margin groups, you know. And then, so it was difficult to organize them. Maybe that's why there was a need for the organic evolution of conference leaders who had enough standing and had the trust of their colleagues, so they can actually convene small negotiating groups to tackle some of the critical issues, you know. So, as you know, Nilofer, 10 years after our third conference, I chaired the Earth Summit in Rio. And some of the lessons I learned from that conference, I brought to Rio and refined the negotiating process. But every conference is different, you know. Every conference is different, the agenda is different, the personalities are different, the atmosphere is different. And as a conference leader, it's very challenging to people like Rena and I to understand this process, to take hold of it, to nudge people forward, to build a culture of goodwill.
Yeah, there are many moving parts, definitely. Yeah, go ahead, Tara.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I mean, as a Singaporean myself, I'm very proud to call both of you my fellow countrymen, but do you think there's any role that Singapore, in the sense that as a small state, we were, I guess, perceived as not having that much stake or positions or hard-held positions, and therefore that enabled both of you to successfully negotiate the conclusion of the conference, both conferences?
Well, I would say there are many other Singaporeans who have played the role of facilitator, neutral chairman, you know. Mm-hmm. The UN Mediation Convention was due in critical part to the good work of Natalie Morris Sharma. You know, she gained the trust of her colleagues. She was able to bring people together to evolve a consensus. And if you look at the UN today, two Singaporeans, David Koh and Berhan Ghafoor, have been elected to chair the open-ended working group on cybersecurity. You know, so these are important positions they hold, and the reason why their colleagues ask them to take the chair is because they have confidence in their competence, in their objectivity, neutrality, and their reliability, I would say. You know.
Can we speak of what might be called the Singapore School of Diplomacy?
Well, I always I liked your phrasing of it, which was pragmatic principles, or principles of pragmatism. I think it was something that you had, Prof. Koh had mentioned in one of your early articles.
Yeah. Actually, I didn't invent the term. I was borrowing it from U Thant, the third UN Secretary General. I was close to him because I was a perm rep at the time. And somebody once asked him, how would you describe yourself? What are you? And he said, I'm a pragmatic idealist.
That's it, pragmatic idealist, that's it.
Yeah. And many people say, it's a non sequitur, it's contradictory, you know. You're a pragmatist, you're an idealist. How can you be a pragmatic idealist, you know? But I think it makes sense to me that you're ideal, but you're also realistic, you know. So you try to achieve ideals that can be achieved, which are practical. You know?
I'm looking at the question. I want to acknowledge and welcome also Janine Felsen, someone we know very well from the BBNJ. Thank you so much for joining us. And it's a great question. It was on my mind. So first of all, great exchange and tremendous to have the historical context of the two processes. It would be interesting to learn whether there was a difference in terms of male-female ratio in the two.
The third conference was dominated by men, you know. There were no women in any leadership position. It's a reflection of the time, you know, and how much progress we made. You know, we have a woman president of BBNJ.
Yes,
I think many of the, and for those who don't know Janine, I think had the hardest task among all of us, because Janine, from the days of the PrepCom, was the facilitator for that most complex element of marine genetic resources and the sharing of benefits.
Yeah.
And she, you know,
Too big one.
You know, what we discuss about building trust and, you know, finding consensus, you know, credit really goes to Janine for her hard work. I mean, I think really times have changed because many of the key roles in the conference were played by women. This is not to say, you know, I've never been that sort of person that is all, oh yeah, woman, ultra-feminist sort. But I mean, I think both men and women contributed to the success of the IGC. But specific to women, because this is, you know, March is International Women's Day, I shall say a little more, which is that women played key roles as facilitators, as leaders of their delegations, as coordinating within the secretariat, as providing conference services, as in civil society as well, as the observers, you know, supporting the delegates. Women were everywhere. And not just women, but young women who have bright futures ahead of them. And I hope they will use this conference as a bellwether for what's possible for us as we move forwards and try to come all of us together to work together. I hope that they will remember, they will take away from this process good memories and understand that no matter how difficult, no matter how many road bumps we hit, we can do it. I used to say that in the process, some people were going very fast towards the finish line, like thinking we were in a 100-meter sprint. Other people were ambling a little slower, thinking they were running the marathon. And I wanted to say to everyone, actually, we're all running the 3,000-meter steeplechase. I think that's like the most difficult race ever. We have to go into the water, we have to climb over the hurdles, but we'll get to the finish line in the end. And I hope people remember that.
I'm sure they will. And I wonder too, I think UNCLOS bred its own kind of camaraderie of colleagues who really, BBNJ, I have this sense will also be, when we look back 5 or 10 years, there will be the BBNJ, characters, that camaraderie, and that's something that I don't think every negotiation process produces. So I think that, I do believe it was a special negotiation, really, and much credit to everyone, to the delegates, absolutely. The facilitators did fantastic work, and took a long time, but well worth it. I know there are other questions, and I'm not going to go into it, but I do want to acknowledge people who have asked them. Our dear friend, Sun Zhen, who used to be at CIL. She had a question about ratification, and we certainly hope that the treaty will be like Paris Agreement, ratified quickly. And I thank Cheryl Tan from the Straits Times, Wei Zhu as well, Joel Ong and Ong Baksuwon for your questions. Forgive us for not necessarily going into them unless someone it feels that they would like to, but we are coming slowly to the end. I thought it might be nice to just have some final words, some reflections on not just the BBNJ and UNCLOS, but can we be optimistic about multilateralism? I mean, does BBNJ show that
so
it's still alive?
So let me make a very short concluding statement. I think we live in an increasingly unstable and dangerous world. I see a new division in the world. I think the relationship between the two superpowers are getting to a very dangerous point when an armed conflict between them, possibly over Taiwan, is within the realm of possibility. In this dark and increasingly unstable world, there are rainbows. And I recently wrote a short op-ed talking about the 3 rainbows. I would say the success of the BBNJ IGC is a very big rainbow. It shows to us that in spite of these generally negative trends, it is possible to succeed. That multilateralism is alive. The willingness of countries to meet, to discuss, to come to an agreement, to cooperate, it's alive, So have faith. So my final message is have faith.
Rena, last word to you.
Well, I cannot say anything else except to say what he said. I mean, there are many dedicated and committed men and women out there who are prepared to work on a lot of these issues. You know what Ambassador Ko said, to have faith. It may, very early on in the process, someone shared with me this, what I'm told is an African proverb, which is that if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And I think that we can, what these processes show us, not just BBNJ, but COP15, 27, all these processes show us is that we can go together and we must go together. And it may take longer than we would like. It may take, it may take a lot more sleepless nights, but it's worth it. And we should press on.
Yeah, thank you so much. You both, have faith, keep going. It is collective action, multilateralism, international law matters. And I think it's such a great example. From CIL, Tara, all of us, first of all, thanks to all who joined us, really. And thank you, Ambassador Ko, Ambassador Lee. You are great friends of CIL. You are giants in the field. We really are inspired by your work. And we will be continuing May 5th. We'll have another forum. This is the year of BBNJ. So CIL will be hosting another forum with Ambassador Lee and Tommy Ko and others. So keep posted, keep your eye on CIL. And thank you to everyone, and everyone stay well.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.